So to start mapping in this texture, which is really pretty complex, I started off by just figuring out where the ridges or the lines of this crossed over sort of woven pattern should be. Mapping that out can kind of help serve as a guide as I go from there on out. And then I thought, I'm just going to give everything a really light value to start with, just kind of shading in several different light directions, and then using a Q-tip to really blur and blend all that together. I just use that Q-tip in lots of like little small circular directions, and that kind of helps smooth all of that out. I then thought I'd kind of start with an easier section by creating that really dark edge with that bright white highlight sort of shading around it and creating some of the stitching. I feel like that sort of would help anchor some of the textures that I'm getting ready to start experimenting with. I always like to start with the easy stuff and then build my way up to some of the harder areas. Next, I noticed that each one of these ridges sort of has a highlight at the peak of each one. So I used my eraser with sort of some jagged, kind of imperfect erasing lines, went through and pulled out where each one of those highlights should sort of be. And then go through with my pencil, and sorry, this is out of the frame just a little bit, but going through with my pencil with some kind of really rough, sketchy, hatchy lines, started to sort of fill in the darker values, pushing those shadows. On the opposites, as the ridge kind of rolls over into the concave part, it gets much darker. And you can use like the really sharp point of an eraser to pull back out any highlights as you go. And just using really imperfect kind of lines, almost sort of like squiggles almost. Some dots, some dashes, some really rough, imperfect lines to start filling in those dark values. And I use the Q-tip to kind of smear and soften them as I kind of continue to layer. And it was really just, I sort of found a process of shading with some just kind of rough marks where I saw dark values, smoothing it over with a Q-tip, and then going back in and pushing some more, and then going back in with an eraser to lighten out some of the highlight bits again, and just really working back and forth with the eraser, my pencil, and a Q-tip multiple times to start to build up that weird sort of textured area. One of the things that I've sort of noticed with textures like this that are really complex, you don't want to make any of your marks too perfect where they're perfect dashes that are all symmetrical and even. You almost want your hand to sort of shake uncontrollably as you do that, and that sort of just is like a weird thing that ends up actually making a more realistic texture because it's more organic, it's more abstract as you go. And just think of it sort of as layers. It's not all going to be perfect in the first layer or the second layer or the third layer, but just keep working and pushing, layering and smoothing it out with a Q-tip and pulling back out highlights with your eraser. Really experimenting. I've never done this texture before. This was totally new to me, but just based on what I know about value, where I can erase in highlights and push shadows darker, and just trying to mimic what I see, thinking about it just as lights and darks. Where do I see lights? Where do I see darks? Pushing those marks. And eventually, through lots of layers, you're going to eventually get somewhere where it starts to take on a sense of realism. Now, this did take me quite a while. It took about half an hour to just get this one little section done. So this is a great thing to watch some reruns of your favorite TV show or listen to some music while you're working to help the time pass. And just keep in mind and just really keep thinking, where are the lights? Where are the darks? What sort of marks do I see? And so while you're working, also sort of step back and look at the shoes as a whole and see where are the brightest highlights and where are the darkest shadows. Where do you maybe kind of lose the textures and it sort of just fades away and becomes just more of a flat value. Really, you want to highlight the textures where you really see them and then sort of let them kind of fade off in the areas where they're not as prevalent and not as dominant. And that's really going to give you that good sense of realism. This shoe drawing is interesting because you do have a really nice section of highlights towards the top of that band. And then you also have some nice reflected light down on the lower right-hand side. But remember, you're just trying to give the impression of that texture. It doesn't have to be exactly correct. You're just going to give the viewer that impression and it will become very believable.